Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2013 Advanced. In this last section, specifically looking at some of the more advanced features of forms in Access 2013, I'm going to look at 2 or 3 other really useful features, and then I'm going to set you quite a challenging exercise to do. We're still looking at student details at the moment, and we're going to look at the pages which are in the details section of the form. Now these pages are part of what's called a tab control. You may have seen tab controls before, and if you were starting from a blank page you would insert a tab control. It's in the controls group there, of course, on the design tab of the form design tools, and a tab control basically has a number of tabs and each tab corresponds to one page of information. The terms tab and page are basically used interchangeably, generally speaking. Now here we've got 5 tabs, and each tab has a different kind of information on it. If I just bring up the properties sheet, you'll see that as I click on each tab I can see the selection change, and these are generally named something page, except for the last one that's just called courses. Now within each page there is the control itself, and if you select that you can have events. There are format, data and other properties as well. But then within the page you may choose a number of ways of laying out the information. Now in the case of this courses page, within the page there is a subform, a FRM student courses subform, and the subform of course will have its own data source, formatting and so on. Whereas on the general page, although we have the page itself which is selected at the moment, within the page we have many individual controls of various types. If you right click on one of the tabs you can see the options to insert a page, delete a page, change the page order and so on. So this type of control is really useful when you want to get a lot of information into, as in this case, one form, and not need to keep opening and closing forms, but you can arrange the information in such a way that it's neatly laid out in sensible sections. So that's the tab control. Now we spent a lot of time looking at the student details form. We've looked at a lot of macro code that's used on that form, and I hope you're getting a good idea of just how complex Access applications can become, but also how, if you've got those basic skills that you're starting to build up now in the use of macros and VBA, you can really make powerful applications. What I'd like to look at next is a couple of other features of the student list which we didn't look at earlier on, and they're going to lead us into a fairly complex exercise for you. Now I hope that one consequence of what we've been doing is that you're going to be encouraged to look at each of these buttons, what each of them does, look at the code for them, use the help, search online, look in the Microsoft MSDN help and so on, find out exactly what each of them does. I want to look at one of them now though, because it's a really clever one, and then I want to look at the search and filter facility, because again there's very useful things in that as well. The really useful one is ShowHide Fields. If you're presenting your users with datasheet view type of data, and perhaps you've got record with many fields, depending on what the users are doing they may want to see different combinations of those fields. Well, rather than giving them many different versions of datasheet view, this is a great little facility. Just click on ShowHide Fields and up comes the Unhide Columns dialog. And notice how straightforward this dialog is. Basically you uncheck what you don't want to see, you check what you do want to see. If I wanted to actually see the IDs that we've talked about so much in the last few sections, there they are. If I wanted to see first name, again there is first name. So that's a really neat feature. The next question is, how does that work? Well, let's go into design view, select show hide features, bring up the property sheet, go to the event tab, click on embedded macro, and you'll be very pleased to hear that it's simply run menu command, and the command is unhide columns. And basically there are many such commands in macros in Access. This is good news, where all you have to do is run one command, and in this case it brings up a dialog that does the whole job for you. So that macro really is that straightforward. Now the last piece of code that I'm going to look at very briefly here concerns the use of search and filter facilities. Now again, I would encourage you to look at the code from the Microsoft sample database. It's all there. And if I just click on that filter button there, notice one of the things that comes up is a couple of options to clear filter and manage filters. There are facilities within this code for users to create their own filters, to save them and to manage those filters, and that can be an extremely useful facility to give your users. Now we don't have time on the course to go through how the management of filters all works, but I hope you know enough now to look into that yourself. But I do want to look very briefly at a couple of features of search because they're also important. So I'm going to click in that search box. Notice how it contains the word search at the moment. When I click on it, it goes blank. I'm going to search for dough. Now to actually do the search, I click on the magnifier there, click on that, and it comes up with the only person called dough, and then the magnifier becomes an X, and the X will enable me to cancel the search and start again. Now I want to look at a couple of features of how that functionality works. So let's go into Design View and take a look at those. Now the first thing to point out is that the search box, which is a text box but is an unbound control, you can see it selected there, has no events associated with it, which you may find a little bit surprising. But if we look at the Format tab in the Properties sheet, there's something very important there, and that is this custom format. The search box is intended to hold text. When you're dealing with a text field, if you have a custom format with 1 or 2 semicolons in it, the format before the first semicolon is the format to use for regular text. The @ there means that basically if a user types something into that search box, that's what you'll see. After the semicolon, if there's only one semicolon with a term after it, that second part, the part after the semicolon, is what's used for either zero-length strings or for null values. So when that box is empty or contains a null, what it will contain is open square brackets, black, close square brackets. Well, if you're familiar with custom formatting, you'll know that that means in black, the color black. And then in the double quotes, search means you'll see the word search. That means that this is a rather clever piece of formatting. Says if there is any text in there, normally typed by a user, just display that text. But if that control is empty, either it has a zero-length string in it or a null value, display the word search. And what that means to you when you're writing your macro code or your VBA code to handle all of this is that if you want it to say just search in that box, all you need to do in your code is to either put a zero-length string in that field or to change its content to null. And we'll see a little bit more about how that works in just a moment. Now let's turn our attention to the command button search clear. You can see it here. It's the button with the X on it. And something that may not have been apparent to you, if I just move that button just a little, what you'll see is that the search button is actually behind it. And the way on which the search and then clear search functionality in this page works is that these buttons alternate between being visible and invisible, and that determines which of those two buttons you can see at any one time. Now we're going to look very briefly at the code that deals with this visibility and invisibility, and that will also link through to the clearing of the search box that we looked at just now. So with the search clear button selected and back in position, let me go to the event tab in the properties sheet. In this case, it doesn't say embedded macro. It actually says filters.clearFilter. You should recall from earlier on in the course that we actually created macros such as the Hello World macro and the AutoExec macro. And what's happened in this particular database is that some of the macros are not embedded within the controls. They're actually stored as separate macros. And what this particular example illustrates is that if you have a macro, in this case called filters, you can put submacros within it. And each of the submacros can be used in one specific place, or maybe in some cases in several places. And this is sometimes a good way to arrange the macros in your Access application. We can still access the macro using the ellipsis on the right. But if you just look at the drop down for a moment, note the list of available macros. You can have the filters macro itself, and then you can also access any of the submacros within the filters macro. So let's click on the ellipsis and open up the filters macro. And each submacro within that, there's a submacro, apply filter favorite, has its own sequence of commands, and then at some point you get an end submacro command. Let's go down to find that clear filter macro, the one that's in force for this particular control. Now there it is. It's actually pretty straightforward, but we need to just go through it line by line quite quickly. First of all, there's a check related to whether this current project is trusted or not. I'm going to ignore that for the moment. I'm just going to concentrate on 2 or 3 commands. One of the commands is set the property of the control named search clear, that's the button with the cross that we were looking at just now, to 0. Now value of 0 means false, so that means we're setting the visibility of that button to false, which means it's going to become invisible. Whereas we're setting the value of the control name search go, that's the magnifier glass control, the value of that, the visibility of that is being set to -1, which is true. So in that pair of with that pair of set property commands, what we're doing is making the search clear button invisible and the search go button visible. And then immediately after that, if the current project is trusted, set the value of the search box, text box, to 0 length string, which means we know that it will then contain the word search. So what we do effectively in this submacro is to set the search back to its start point, if you like. There's no actual text in the search box, but we've got the word search in it, and it's the magnifier glass button that's visible, not the cross button. And then having done all that, we have stop macro, end submacro, and that's the end of it. So that's a look at part of the functionality of the search on this form, and I'll leave you to work through the rest of it and put the whole thing together to make a working search function. So now I'm going to set you really quite a substantial exercise to do. This will take probably a considerable amount of time to do, and the starting point is example 9, so it's the version of the movie database that you can see in front of you here. And what I want you to do is to make a FRM movie list form. There is no such form at the moment, which basically lists the movies on the database. It should look pretty much like the student list that we've been working on quite a bit in the last few sections. And on that, obviously you could put various controls corresponding to the equivalent ones on the student list. I would specifically though like you to include the open and new type facility that is in the datasheet itself. I also want you to implement ShowHide Fields. Now if you're feeling really brave and you can find the time, you could maybe try to implement that search facility as well. Don't worry about filters. The filter's not particularly difficult, but it will take some time. Just to implement the search facility using the search box and the pair of buttons, you'll obviously need to look into the rest of the code needed to complete that. And then to go with that, what I'd like you to do is to implement a FRM movie details form. And the FRM movie details form, I want it to have a nice header, and then 3 tabbed pages. 1 page for the general details of the movie, 1 page for the actors and their roles within the movie, and 1 page for the rental details. So our movie maintenance form we've got here, which is quite poor really, let's split it up into 3 pages. There won't be much on any of the pages, but it'll certainly give you scope for increasing that later on. And then make sure that the movie list form and the movie details form work well together. Oh, and just one other thing, I'll leave it to you whether you code it using macros or VBA. And that's it for this section. My answer to that is example 10. I'll see you in the next section.